Look, Infinity Train is the epitome of, oh my god, did they just do that? I thought this was a kid's show. Seriously, everyone has that reaction, us included. A huge factor to this reaction, though, is how death plays a pretty big part in the series. Every book has had one or two big deaths that really take the audience by surprise. But they're not just done for shock value. I'd argue that every death in Infinity Train means something, running deeper than initially perceived. So we're going to run through every death in the series and explain their significance on a deeper level. Spoiler warning for obvious reasons. Let's start in Season 1 with Atticus. This was the only fake-out death that was undone in the series. Every other death was permanent. And thank God, I mean, we love Atticus. He's the best.
You're a good boy.
I'm a good man.
But I'll be the first to say that his death was more than just a cheap emotional grab at the audience. Atticus dying gives Tulip a reason to stick around, get through to Amelia, and aid 1-1 to reclaim the train after obtaining her door home. Something the conductor hammers in with Atticus's death is the idea that it was Tulip's fault, putting her at a low point because this reflects something she just began to overcome with her parents' divorce. Tulip blamed herself, found assurance that it wasn't her fault, much like how the unfinished car wasn't 1-1's fault, and it really wasn't. However, with how in-depth the show has gotten, I believe it goes deeper than that, as in hindsight, this wasn't just Amelia trying to discourage Tulip from 1-1 reclaiming the train, but Amelia projecting onto Tulip. Everything Amelia says and does to Tulip in this moment, right down to pulling the trigger, was Amelia coming down on herself for the death of her fiancé. Amelia then taunts Tulip, remarking that Atticus and 1-1 had a place on the train, she brought them here, and the result was catastrophe. In the very next episode, The Past Car, we learn of Amelia's origins that give us insight into the relationship with her deceased loved one. Applying Amelia's own words to her life, Ulrich seems to be confident in their youth, cheering Amelia up whenever she ran into misfortune, but grows up a bit more nervous and hesitant in their adult life. Not to mention they happen to go to the same university and graduate together in the same major, a pretty big commitment for any relationship. While they could have just shared the same interest, it seems too picture perfect, and now that book 4 is poised to focus on Amelia, we may get more insight on the nature of this relationship. Still, it's very likely that Ulrich made a few sacrifices to be with Amelia throughout their life, even if it isn't exactly what he wanted. Aligning with Amelia's words to Tulip of denizens having a place on the train, and Tulip's response of they were just trying to help, only for Amelia to point out the destruction. Ulrich just wanted to help Amelia. He followed her throughout his life, and it led to an accident that resulted in his sudden death. In her moment of chastising Tulip, Amelia got a bit too in her feelings, sealing this projection with the sci-fi bullet that gives Atticus a similar fate. But he's okay now, luckily. Speaking of Ulrich's off-screen death allows us to empathize with Amelia, but it's not that cut and dry. A big question for the Infinity Train for the longest time was, who else is on the train? Is it just kids, or can adults make the cut too? We got an answer with Amelia, as Ulrich's death shows us why adults need the Infinity Train just as much as kids do, if not way more. Amelia fell into a great depression after Ulrich's death, and if what we just speculated on is true, then she obviously felt immense guilt. When Amelia first boarded the train, deep in her depression, she was approaching her campus for an unknown reason, the roof of a building vanishing before her eyes. Why was she approaching this campus, and why did the train eliminate that roof in particular? Well, a common interpretation / fan theory is that Amelia was returning to her campus to end her life, planning to jump off the roof of the building that whisked her away to the train. And there's not much evidence to argue an alternative here. Within minutes, Infinity Train and Ulrich illustrated the toll death can take on us, especially in adulthood. Adults don't have everything figured out. Their worlds can change in an instant and unfortunately have no idea what to do because it's the worst case scenario to expect. Amelia spent actual decades trying to bring Ulrich back to life through the train because living her old life through a simulation was preferable to facing a new, uncertain life without her loved one. But she repeatedly failed, although now she has a daughter. Kinda. We'll see where her story goes. Hopefully. Mace. The first big graphic death of the series, this moment had the audience absolutely losing their minds. It's the moment where Infinity Train began to look a lot less like a kid's show and more like a teen/young adult show that it always wanted to be. And if we're honest, definitely is by book 3. We all hated Mace, okay, so no one was sad to see him go, but it was shocking to see a protagonist, especially a 13-year-old girl, commit such a brutal murder. This death came after Mace and MT Lake were caught together in the wasteland, having played the cat and mouse game all season. Mace, in his final moments, is psychologically torturing Lake, pretty much, trying to convince her that she's just a byproduct of the train, and this whole interaction ends brutally with Mace being grinded up against the wheel of the train, at the hands of Lake. Mace's death solidifies a point that Lake was trying to drive home. She's not just a reflection. She's not Tulip. She's her own person. The end of book 1 shows that Tulip would rather try to find a peaceful resolution and use logic to talk sense into an adversary than just straight up fight and try to brawl, although her temper is still on display. However, for Lake, while it was a matter of life or death survival, we saw throughout this book she would dropkick anyone at a moment's notice. Still, it didn't do much for her to be seen by the mirror police as anything more than a rowdy reflection who needs to be put in her place. And if she wouldn't do that, then Mace thought she was better off dead. Mace didn't anticipate for Lake to do the most un-Tulip thing ever, which was to end his life. Mace's death was more than just a comeuppance. It was a display of determination and desperation. How far one's limits can be pushed when fighting for the right to exist. She didn't take this in stride either. She immediately has a moment where she comes to terms with what she just did before getting up and moving on. That in itself is an example of how flawed this train is. It'll help you at the price of trauma that you'll have to work through. A soul for a soul type situation. The Dead Lizard. Okay, this one may feel silly to include, but hear me out. In the tape car, Lake witnesses the process of how a passenger obtains a number, which includes their memories being scanned. A passenger whose memories we skim through is a little girl who obtains a pet lizard, and soon after mistakenly kills it. This goes by quick and is never touched on again, but really consider how traumatic this can be. Imagine being a little kid. You probably have a vague understanding of death, but never experienced it firsthand at this point in your life. And not only do you have to confront the concept of death, but confront the reality that you're capable of ending another living creature's life, and you're like 6. This shows how complex the issue that brings someone onto the Infinity Train can be. Obviously, a parent will sit down their child, try to explain death, and talk through everything that happened, and how this was an accident, not the fault of a child, that the loss of a pet's life and the loss of a human's life isn't inherently the same, but that's still something extremely heavy, a death that the girl has to carry. Plus, that's a pretty dark lesson to have to learn on this death train. I just hope this girl made it out okay. Sieve. Okay, admittedly, Sieve's demise doesn't run as deep as the others. He got blasted to bits by Alan Dracula in an incredibly well-animated scene. What's more interesting is that a crew member of Infinity Train listed off the brutal plot points of the series, referencing 2 gay cops. It turns out Steve and Mace were actually in a relationship. And despite being the calm and rational one throughout book 2, hell, even in book 1 he was hesitant when Mace made it clear that he wanted to kill MT.
So get the skins and the sander.
Whoa! Hey man, do we really need the sander for this?
Mace's death causes him to snap, and now we have a much clearer understanding as to why. He was in love, and we saw his partner get grinded up by a teenager they were already out to get. That's gotta sting. I hate these two, but I'm happy for them at the same time. Up next, we have the 2 most brutal deaths in the series, starting with Tuba. Honestly, in my opinion, Tuba is the most upsetting death. A core theme in book 3 from the jump is empathy. Seeing others beyond their differences, that the denizens aren't inferior to the passengers, they're equals. We all heard the musical number, it was weirdly catchy. Unlike Grace, however, who gains empathy for Hazel and Tuba, although she was initially aware of Hazel being a denizen, it's practically impossible for Simon to let himself have empathy for denizens. Grace was able to keep an open mind because she always suspected that her belief of the train was misinformed and misguided. But Simon only knew it as the whole truth. He treated it like a code of conduct. It bordered on religious. Combine this with his abandonment issues, Samantha the cat leaving him stranded in the boxcar for dead. Chances are, after his conversation with Tuba and learning of her deceased children, Simon did feel bad for her, and saw that as a very bad thing in his mind. If he trusts this null, he's setting himself up to be betrayed all over again. So he got the jump on Tuba and decided to betray her before she got the chance to betray him. And because he still sees denizens as an extension of the train illusions, he was able to convince himself that this was nothing more than a trick. He needed to be right. Writer Lindsay Gataï said, when talking about Simon, "Oh, Simon. Simon is a clinical narcissist. He absolutely can't stand to be wrong, so he rewrites everything in his mind. I'm always right, therefore everyone who disagrees with me is wrong. And if I'm always right, literally all my actions are justified." But clinical narcissists are also very caring, provided you live by their rules. If physically abusive, they're the type to say, "Why do you make me hit you?" Like in the original Origami car. Alexander Horab has him saying, "You made me do this. I liked what we had." Or in the new Apex by Hey Justin, he says, "Why would I want to change when I'm always right? It's just the saddest thing. If you don't think you need help and you're always right, how can you ever get better?" That's why Simon dies. Needing to be right is a cancer. At the end of the day, Tuba was a victim of someone who refused to be vulnerable, whose toxicity clouded their own judgment, and ultimately this was Simon's undoing as well. Okay, let's address the elephant in the room. It's time to talk about Simon. Simon was the most visually graphic death of the entire series. I don't know how they could ever top this. Simon dies after a showdown with Grace. After the two were growing apart all season, they end up fighting to the death in between 2 train cars. When a golem enters their fight though, things get complicated. Simon almost dies before Grace ends up saving him, only for Simon to stab her in the back and push her off the train, causing him to go completely over the edge. Ultimately, Grace actually gets saved by denizens, the origami birds that she saved earlier, and Simon gets killed by the Gome, the life force being sucked out of him physically, and we see his skeleton. It's about as dark as it could possibly be. A lot of people saw this tragic end as a punishment, but it wasn't intended to be, despite audience reactions. Writer Lindsay Gittai said on Simon's death, "I will just say that while everyone deserves to be redeemed and loved, not everyone will redeem themselves or let themselves be loved. Simon's death wasn't a punishment, he just had a sad ending. Sometimes people have sad endings. As it is in life, so it is in stories. His death wasn't a moral judgment on our part, it was a progression of a bad road his character was determined to walk down. Simon's story and death is sad because that was what we intended. Simon isn't a black and white character, we did that on purpose. No one should feel victorious, it's not that kind of ending." Simon's final moments were the accumulation of him doubling down on his toxic behaviors that were the product of his fears and his trauma. Grace and Simon both shared abandonment issues and a fear of being wrong. However, whereas Grace adapted and warmed up to the truth, Simon couldn't fathom everything he stood for during his time on the train being wrong. The cat left him with a hatred for denizens and a sharp fear of Gomes. His relationship with Grace, although not her own intentions, caused him to become competitive, controlling, number-obsessed, and insecure to be in touch with himself. That last one may seem like it comes out of nowhere, but go back to their conversation in the musical car while raiding with the Apex. Much like how he's eager to impress Grace with his increased number, he quickly grows shy and insecure when she playfully teases him about how he dressed when they first became friends. Obviously, his hatred and lack of empathy for denizens is what caused him to snap after finding out Grace would rather protect a denizen than tell Simon the truth. But that triggered his abandonment issues as well. Those abandonment issues are what truly does him in. Throughout the new Apex, Simon's pretty much already alone. Despite commanding them, once Grace shows up, the kids are very hesitant and confused on what to do, on who to listen to, and it causes them to take a step back when Simon and Grace do get out as they run to the train car. Simon only has himself when attacking Grace. Once the Gome pulls up, Simon makes a break for it. It's a heartbreaking detail you may not catch at first, but he's the first one to immediately run, as obviously his fear consumes him. We know how the story shakes out from there, but let's jump to the moment Simon was actually attacked by the Gome. The Gome didn't just choose Simon, he was the only one in reach at that point, as Grace was flown back to safety near the Apex, who were too lost in the moment to do anything. As the younger kids, they looked to Simon and Grace for guidance. But whereas Grace comforted and encouraged the Apex, leading them into missions, Simon only wanted them to serve him. Simon didn't just push Grace off the train in an attempt to kill her, but figuratively pushed her away from him. Simon quite literally had nobody in his final moments due to his own self-sabotage. You could even see him crying when being reduced to nothing by the Gome. His death is a cautionary tale. What happens if you lack empathy for others? If you can't let go of your false truths, it's what happens if you push others away who are only trying to help. Simon was a jerk, but he certainly was a morally great character who was kinda set up for disaster from the jump, without it necessarily being anyone's direct fault. Yeah, Grace has some responsibility to take for everything. She even acknowledged that herself. But at the same time, are you gonna tell me that 10-year-old Grace had any idea where Simon would end up the moment she met him and boasted about being really good at the train? No, the Infinity Train is flawed. It's meant to help people, but is capable of doing its own damage. All of these deaths reflect that. They reflect the hardships that accompany mental health. They're not justified, save for Mason Steve, for trying to strike first, but they're not supposed to be justified. That's what makes the show so great. Questioning these characters and the decisions they make causes us to question ourselves. It's kind of awesome. But that being said, those are all of the deaths in Infinity Train and the explanation behind all of them. Some were darker than others, but I want to know what you guys think. What death had the most impact on you? Let us know in those comments down below, or tweet to us at Roundtable Vids or me at itsretronemo. As always, if you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a like, share it, and subscribe to the Roundtable for more incredible cartoon content. As always guys, I'm Nemo, this is an Infinity Train video, and I will see you next time. Peace.